Many of us who travel have from time to time run into issues with various airlines, everything from lost or damaged bags, flight delays, or even cancellations. So what do we have as rights as passengers? What is required of the airlines? Well, joining us today to discuss this in more detail is Dr. Gabor Lukacs. He's the president of Air Passenger Rights since 2008. He's been volunteering his time to fight for passenger rights and has filed more than 24 successful complaints with the Canadian Transportation Agency. And he's joining us today from Budapest, Hungary, visiting some family. Dr. Lukacs, welcome to Bridge City News.
Good morning, good afternoon, whichever time it is for you.
Now, from your research, what percentage of Canadian travelers really know what their rights are?
We don't have precise data on that. And of course, that's a fundamental problem that there's so little data available on all passenger rights issues in Canada, which in the US, there's a treasure trove of data from just the Bureau of Statistics. But just from anecdotal evidence, just from dealing with passengers day to day, there is a vast majority of passengers who are not aware of their rights. What perhaps has changed over the last close to 2 decades of advocacy is that now passengers at least ask the question, do I have some rights? While in the past, they just assume that there's none. Still, passengers often look at the airlines for answers about their rights. And of course, the airlines will tell them you have none. So we have made a kind of first step in education of passengers that they now know to ask the question, but still where to find their answers and where to find reliable answers is still a challenge for many passengers.
I recently ran into an issue with an airline. I don't want to say which airline, but I went from Calgary to Las Vegas, Nevada, just to see some of the sites. I really don't gamble. And then I went to Arizona to see the Grand Canyon. But my bag got damaged beyond repair. It was just terrible from the baggage handlers. So I filed a claim, and surprisingly, within 2 weeks or so, they reimbursed me completely for that bag. I was quite shocked. Is that out of the norm, in your opinion?
Well, actually, what the airline is supposed to do in such situations, if it is beyond repair, is to pay for the cost of the replacement baggage. Because you may have purchased the bag a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years ago, and for that price, you're not going to get a new baggage. But when it comes to baggage liability, it is not the depreciated price the airline has to pay for. They have to pay for, the price of replacing it, because after all, there's no market for used baggage the same way you would have a market for used cars where you can actually measure in an economically meaningful way depreciation. So it was a good approximation. Probably they got off cheap, but the law is that if they damage your baggage, and unless your baggage has an inherent defect like it's made of glass, something truly obvious, then the airline will have to pay for damage to the baggage and also damage for its contents, if there is damage to the contents as well.
I understand that in Canada we have something called Air Passenger Protection Regulations, which are administered by the Canadian Transportation Agency. Are they making the rules clear enough for Canadians, in your opinion, or there's still maybe a lot of questions?
There are lots of questions, and the Air Passenger Protection Regulations feel very much like they were written by the airlines for the airlines. They're not only unclear, but on those points that they are somewhat clear or not completely ambiguous, they do seem to very much favor airlines and often just look good on the paper, but in practice make it impossibly difficult for passengers to get compensation, which they should be paid.
I noticed on your Facebook page, a traveler alleges that there's a certain airline has been refusing to rebook passengers on competitors' airline, contrary to the Air Passenger Protection Regulations. And in addition to that, they're also alleging refusing to pay for passenger meals and accommodation, even though it is also required?
Those issues are particularly prominent in WestJet, although Flair is somewhat guilty of that type of issues. But WestJet is a larger airline, so we hear far more about WestJet than Flair, even though Flair is quite bad in many different ways as well. So maybe we need to unpack it. If your flight is delayed or canceled for reasons within the carrier's control, which would include situations such as maintenance issues, certainly crew issues, and so on, and they cannot rebook you on an alternative itinerary that departs no more than 9 hours within the original itinerary, and this has to be next flight, not earlier flight, then the airline has to buy you a ticket on a competitor airline if they cannot do it rebooking on their own partners. So say they have their next available flight only in 12 hours, but there is a flight on a competitor airline in 6 hours, they actually have to take out their corporate credit card and buy you a ticket on that complete their flight within 6 hours. That often or almost never happens, even though that's what the law says. Meals and accommodation is also an issue. WestJet loves to tell people we're going to only cover you up to a certain amount for your accommodation or a certain amount of your meal, and that's not what the law is. The airline has to provide a meal or provide the accommodation or pay for it, and that doesn't, of course, mean that you can go and get drunk or that you can go and buy a luxury special chef restaurant, but just go to a normal restaurant, whichever is available where you are, get a reasonable meal, perhaps not alcohol. That's something the airline will have to pick up the tab for, whether they like it or not. They are not doing it, and they are hoping that passengers don't know what their rights are, and therefore they are not going to pursue their rights.
So if a passenger runs into an issue, should they maybe start taking their complaint to the airline? Maybe start with the airline first?
So in terms of how to handle problems, when you start seeing that there's a problem, the first step is documenting. Keep receipts, record your interactions with the airlines, record your conversations, if necessary, even take a video of your interaction. Then once you have an idea, a good summary of what happened, the first step is always making a demand to the airline. This is what happened, this is what I want you to do. Writing a long multi-page complaint letter is not the way to go. What you want to do as a passenger is a relatively short, professional, business-like letter, starting with what you want, ending with what you want, and in between just explaining the few facts that are needed for a reasonable person to conclude that what you want is really what is owed to you under the law. That's it. I will give them 30 days to respond. If there is no response within 30 days, or if there's no favorable response or no payment within 30 days, the next step is serving the airline with small claims court papers to recover what they owe you. Now, the airlines will love to try to send you to Canadian Transportation Agency. Unfortunately, that organization has been captured by the airline industry. They are not really acting in the public best interest. There are lots of concerns about their impartiality. They also have a huge backlog of years before they often will get to your complaint. So in a small claims court, a judge may agree or disagree with you, but you are going to get most likely a fair hearing. And that's more than what the government can give you at a Canadian Transportation Agency.
Now, we talked a bit about damage bags. What about lost luggage? You know, when this happens, I know I've heard people talk about it's not uncommon for airlines to kind of mislead passengers sometimes as to how much compensation they're entitled to. So let me ask you something. What are we entitled to?
You see, misleading passengers about their rights is a common problem, not just about baggage. When it gets to baggage, there are several sub-issues here. There's a distinction between delayed baggage and lost baggage. A baggage is lost if you don't get it back within 21 days of the time you were supposed to get it when you arrived at your destination. But say your bag is delayed only for 3 days. Airlines will try to tell you we're going to pay you only $50 or $100 per day, and you can use only that money for your incidentals. That's untrue. Under the law, if your baggage is delayed, you can incur up to $2,300 per passenger of reasonable out-of-pocket expenses to purchase items that you need immediately. This is not a license to go on a shopping spree, and I caution passengers not to do that, because I've seen cases when passengers have purchased an unreasonable amount of items and reasonable quantity and reasonable prices and unreasonable items themselves that were not even needed that much. And the judges just said, no, we're not going to order the airline to pay for it. But for example, if you go to a business meeting, normal business meeting, you arrive and your baggage in which you have your suit and a tie and your dress shoes are not there. You can certainly go out and either rent one if you can, or buy one if that's what you need for your business meeting. And if it means $1,000 in expense, let it be. What you cannot do is go to a wellness or a spa and all of a sudden buy a suit there, because it's not reasonable, nor can you expect to buy skiing boots if you're going to a business meeting. It has to be relevant to the purpose of your trip, the expenses that you incur. But if that's the case, then up to the $2,300 Canadian dollars limit, the airline will have to pay for your bill. Now, if your baggage does not arrive within 21 days, that's a lost baggage at that point, then the airline has to pay for the entire contents of the baggage and the baggage itself. How you prove it, that can be a problem with your notes. That's why I, for example, keep very detailed packing lists of what I have in my baggage, and about their value, you just purchase replacements, and that's how you prove what is the replacement value for the loss, which is a bit tricky, but that's really how you can deal with the situation. Airlines don't always pay up, and that's part of the game. If they don't, After 30 days, we serve them with small claims court papers.
So, Dr. Lukacs, let me ask you something. How long can an airline keep passengers waiting in the plane on the tarmac?
Under the current rules put in place by the government, they can keep a passenger there up to 3 hours and 45 minutes with all the extensions they can add to it. And this is something that has been quite a concern to me when the APPR, the Air Passenger Protection, were introduced, because actually prior to that, most airlines had terms and conditions that date back to the previous government's agreement with the airlines about codes of behavior, and that was actually 90 minutes. So the APPR was relaxing the requirement of how long a passenger can be kept on the tarmac, which is quite unfortunate.
There are times when a passenger will be denied the right to board an aircraft. Now, if this ends up being the airline's mistake, is it true that the passenger is not entitled to any compensation?
Any compensation is maybe an overstatement, but denied boarding compensation maybe not. Let's just unpack that. So when you show up at the airport with your passport, with your documents, with your ticket, there are two ways you can end up not getting on the plane. One is, say they don't check you in for some reason, even though you're there on time. And the other is, you do have all your boarding passes, you show up at the boarding gate, and there are too many passengers there. In Canada, unfortunately, the current government defined denied boarding as a very narrow case when you are already at the boarding gate and there are just too many passengers compared to the number of seats. And if you show up at the check-in counter and they just tell you, sorry, we don't like your face, we won't transport you today. In Canada, that would not fit the legal definition of denied boarding, even though in the rest of the world, especially in the European Union, which has the gold standard of passenger protection, that would obviously be denied boarding. It doesn't matter whether you are denied boarding because it was overbooked or because they didn't have enough staff members at the check-in counter. What matters is you showed up at the airport with a ticket, with a passport, and still you didn't get on the plane. So in Canada, unfortunately, we have a problem that when it happens to you at a check-in counter, for example, then you can still claim damages under breach of contract, or if you travel internationally under international law for your delay. But you cannot actually claim damages under the air passenger protection regulations under the heading of involuntary denied boarding. And this is one of the major issues that we have been flagging for the past 5-6 years with the government, that this should be fixed. It would affect a smaller number of people, but surely if you paid good money for your ticket, and if you have all your travel documents, and you are at the airport on time, and you still don't get on that plane for no fault of your own, there's no reason on earth why you should not be fully compensated.
So how does Canada compare with the European Union regulations? Are we a little behind, perhaps?
We are badly behind. The Canadian air passenger protection regulations are a mockery of what passenger rights could be and should be in Canada. In Europe, they have a system which is very simple to administer, very simple to determine whether you are owed compensation or not. You don't need all kind of data that only the airline has, which is what's happening in Canada, about why the flight was delayed or canceled and what type of issues happen. All you need to look at in Europe is when your flight was supposed to land, when your flight actually landed, and whether there was any kind of so-called extraordinary circumstances, which is something as extreme as a snowstorm, as volcanic eruption, or God forbid, act of terrorism, that you can normally learn from public sources. If you can rule out extraordinary circumstances just by browsing the news, then you can quite safely determine how much compensation is owed to you. And that's what we are sorely missing in Canada. In Canada, there are so many loopholes, so many excuses for airlines, that it makes it very difficult, not just for passengers, but also for judges, for decision makers, to determine quickly, efficiently, whether a couple $100 compensation is owed to the passenger. From a societal perspective, not just as a passenger rights advocate, if the cost to society of determining the fate of a few $100s ends up being thousands of dollars, then something is wrong with the system. And that's something that we have been cautioning, again, the government since 2019 approximately, even perhaps a bit earlier, that this would not work. And that's what we are seeing now. That's why we have a huge backlog at the Canadian Transportation Agency, because just deciding one complaint is taking and disproportionate amount of time and resources.
Dr. Gabor Lukacs is the president of Air Passenger Rights. Thanks so much for joining us today from Budapest, Hungary.
Thank you very much for having me.